Top 40 radio and AM and FM radio really had nothing for him. HFS was still playing granola rock at that point in time, a lot of Grateful Dead and Jefferson Starship, and not much else.
And so really when the Minor Threat thing came along, or actually it would have been the Youth Brigade and Teen Idols, that was it completely tipped things upside down, because it was finally...
A lot of that had to do with the Slicky Boys. The Slicky Boys were the genesis of most of that, because one of the first groups I met when I opened up the store in Rockville, Kim Kane, when the Slicky Boys came in, and we started going to a lot of shows together.
Right.
And he had just put out their first album, Separated Vegetables, which I subsequently reissued on Limp a year or so later.
Right.
And I put out their second EP, Mersey, Mersey Me, which I didn't have anything to do with producing. I just released it on Limp. And that was the first release on Limp Records. And their third EP, the one with God Tell Me Why, was the first one that I recorded with them. And by then, Mark Noon had become the lead singer, and Martha had gone on to working with a new band, The Deceits, which I also put a record out by. But the Slicky Boys had a strong local following with the club scene, and a lot of the young kids would start going to see them, and they'd have bands like Bad Brains play with them, and that's how these young punks, they were called teeny punks at that period of time, and then subsequently Georgetown punks, since most of them seemed to live in the Georgetown area, hang out in the Georgetown area. But they didn't really have any place to go for their music before that. They were too young to get into the clubs. So when they started getting a little older, that's when they were able to get involved in the scene more. But they started working with me because they shopped at my store.
Right.
You didn't have to be a certain age to shop at a record store, like you had to be to get into a club. And when it came time to go in the studio, they asked me, because they liked the things I had done with Slicky Boys and the work that I had done with the Bad Brains, even though I didn't end up producing the Bad Brains session. I produced it in terms of paying for it, and sent Kim Kane in to do it, because HR scared the hell out of me the day before, because he stood in the store for hours on end just staring at me behind the counter with a mean scowl on his face. And I was so totally freaked out. I just said, I called him Marty, that's Kim Kane's name, and I said, you got to go in and do the session for me. So he went into Don's and Tars the following morning on a Saturday, and the Bad Brains were 3 hours late showing up for the session. They were coming from Forestville, and they had all their gear they had to unpack. By the time they finished, they had time to whip through 4 songs in about a 15-minute period of time, and one of those we subsequently issued on the Best of Limp album, Don't Bother Me. I did a remix of that, and we put it out.
And what were the other tunes? Was it Stay Close to Me? Is that probably what...
No, Stay Close to Me is the other side of Pay to Count. That's the 45 they did up in New York.
Okay.
They had done several sessions locally before they went up to New York. They moved up to New York and did Pay to Come, and that was...
The Black Dots LP, maybe, or...
I think the Black Dots LP was released later on. They did the Roar tapes, which was really the first thing, and then they did the album on PVC that Rick Ocasek did, Rock for Life, but that was after the Pay to Come 45. So as far as I know, the Roar tape was not issued on vinyl at that point in time. It was later. The Black Dot stuff was not released until later on Caroline. The Pay to Come 45 they did up in New York City, and then the Rock for Light album is the thing that really established them. And because they weren't established at that point in time, is one of the reasons why Pay to Come goes for so much money now. Sandy over at CD Depot in College Park sold a copy on eBay a couple months ago for almost $3,000 to a person in Canada.
Who was the first of the Georgetown punks that you hired on? Because seems like half of them worked for you. But I mean, I know you had Ian, you had Danny Ingram, Bert Kiros worked for you. Am I saying his last name right?
You got me. He worked for me for many years.
And you're not even sure?
I just call him Bert because we called him Bert Q because nobody was really sure of how to say it, so we just didn't say it.
Kiros or Kiros?
I would imagine it'd be Kiros, but...
So, did he talk much when he worked in the store? Did he just follow?
No.
Okay, so
we got along great,
Okay.
But all of those things happened after I'd worked with the groups in the studio. The first session I did with any Discord-related bands was the Teen Idol session. We did a demo tape, and then I recorded their first EP. It was released on disc. They wanted to do it on Limp, but I was closing down the label at that point in time, and so I suggested they start their own record label, which they did. And then the Teen Idols broke up shortly after that, after a trip to California, and Minor Threat got together, and I produced a demo with them and did their first EP.
So they weren't working. None of them were working for you or anything at that time. They sort of.
I think maybe around the time when Salad Days, when In My Eyes came out, Ian was definitely working at the store by then, because I remember him bringing the tape in after they had done it over to Don's and listening to it and saying, just being totally blown away by it and saying, well, there's no point in me even doing anything with any of these guys anymore, because they've progressed so many years ahead in just 2 or 3 years it was just incredible.
But you did do production work on their first 45, right?
The first 45 I produced and mixed. And I did a session with Youth Brigade, which was never issued on a 45, but some of the cuts ended up on Flex Your Head. I did the Teen Idols EP and the SOA EP. All of those I did.
Okay.
So 3 of the first 4 Discord EPs I did.
Was there a defining moment where they all came into the store, or how did you start, or did they start trickling in, or how did that
No.
play out?
I think Ian and Henry were probably the first, and Henry was not in a band at that point in time. He hung around with the Teen Idols, hung around with Minor Threat, and during the period of time when Minor Threat was a band, that's when Henry started SOA, and took them over to Don's as well, and did that EP.
So also to sort of go back with the 30 Seconds Over DC, which
don't hold that up in the sun too long.
we're just giving it a real quick flash there. The 30 Seconds, how did you come across some of those bands? Was Kim sort of introducing you, or were they also customers? Because, like you say, it was kind of more of a fuddy-duddy, the mid-20s and older people that were just tired of disco or maybe were sick of Genesis. And so I'm sort of curious how you started coming across some of those people.
At that point in time, for most of these people, they didn't have any other stores to go to. So that's why there's such a cross population on the album of people from Virginia, people from Baltimore.
So the George Divleys, the Tim Carters, all those people, they were coming up to the
for the most
store.
part. The half Japanese got on there because they were customers of Howie's store up in Baltimore, the Music Machine.
Yeah.
And he got them on there.
Was he doing some recordings of bands also back in the day?
No, never did
it
any.
It was just strictly a retail.
Strictly retail, but they were big customers of his store because he was doing the same thing in Baltimore that I was, carrying a lot of the punk and imports, and we subsequently went on 30 buying trips to England together, buying stuff for individual stores. But at that point in time, there was a station locally, WGTV FM, which a guy named David Howcroft was on there. And Steve Lorber also did a show on there, Mystic Eyes, but he didn't play any of the new wave or punk stuff. He was strictly into the 60s punk and psychedelic stuff. But David Howcroft, who wrote the original liner notes for the original issue of 30 Seconds Over DC, that album you just showed, he had some of these groups contact him on his radio show wanting to know how to get exposure for their bands. And a lot of them came into my store, and then just because of the first few releases, we had put out we got things in the mail unsolicited. So I put them all together and put it all together and took it over to Don's and mastered the thing.
Who did the pressing, do you recall?
The early Limp stuff was done by Nashville Record Productions, which Discord subsequently used for all of their material until they went with the English company. They got involved with Southern,
So list out some of the artists that you did individual releases by on Limp. You obviously did the Slicky Boys. You did the reissue.
In terms of things I produced or things I released?
Just releases.
Okay. Well, it'd be probably easy to do the albums first. The albums we did, 30 Seconds Over DC was the first.
Yeah.
The Separated Vegetables was probably the second. There was only 100 made of that.
Yeah.
The Best of Limp was probably after that. Connected LP would have been after that. And then the Nightman album. And the last album was going to be Tommy Keene's first album. And The Matrix, if you look at the record, it says Limp 707, 007. But he put it out on his own label, Avenue, because I told him I was winding down the label.
You'd already had the metal plates made up?
The plates had been made up at that point in time when I made the decision. The store was just getting too busy at that point in time. I had just opened up the second shop in 1980 and was trying to run the store in Virginia. It was just too much I was doing.
If you had spare time, what would you have done with the label?
Not much. I just felt that it was time to start concentrating on the store. And I mean, the putting out the records was fun for me and the bands, but rarely got paid for anything. The record stores and the distributors were very bad about paying for things, and that happens all the time in the independent industry. Well, it's mostly you have to assume that a certain part of it's just going to be exposure and identity to get your name out there. If you're doing it to make a living, I mean, any band is only going to make money by touring, and the records very rarely make money for anybody except the record companies.